Alright, I've got a really bad flu, so in case I sound really nasal, you know why. Now there are some dinosaurs you grow up with. The sauropods are of course for me, but another one was Iguanodon. This was hugely due to this, what I consider my first ever serious dinosaur book by Dr. David Norman, who is of course an authority on Iguanodon. So I devoured Iguanodon and everything about it from this book and then from others. As one of the first named dinosaurs, it has special historical significance. And having been named in 1825, this is nice timing for Haolonggood to offer its version in the bicentennial year of Iguanodon. The name Iguanodon means iguana tooth, and I'm sure all of you know the story. This incredible animal is very well known from the famous Bernissart excavations revealing over 30 bernissartensis. Iguanodon bernissartensis was about 9 to 11 meters, or 29.5 to 36 feet. Accounting for the upward crane of the neck and all these curves, I estimate the length of this model in neutral position to be about 29 centimeters, or 11.4 inches from nose to tail tip, making it 1 to 35 for a 10 meter or 32.8 foot animal. Here's how 1 to 35 looks like with the Wonder Artistic model's humanoid. Of course, I'm sure we wouldn't mind it a bit bigger. This model weighs 260 grams, or 0.6 pounds, or 9.2 ounces. There are two color variants. The blue uses a predominantly grey color we've seen many times before, such as Saurolophus and the very recent Taurosaurus. But when you see it in person, it's better than you think, with even subtle hints of green in the grey. The brown this time has a really cool design using plenty of mottling. There's absolutely nothing crude about the paint applications, both just scream skin pigmentation. And I'm happy to see that at least this doesn't use the cheap stencil pattern method we've seen in their other variants, so each has a legitimately different pattern. Now let's look at the brown. Starting at the head, let's get the obvious out of the way. I think it's safe to say that just like with the PNSO, many people will feel that this isn't what you'd call a quintessential example of an Iguanodon head, due to this bulge here. We'll just take a quick look at the type specimen skull, and I think you can see the difference. Minus this though, I think they captured the posterior part with its boxiness well. This is seen nicely from the top as well, where I feel they've captured from the frontals to the back very closely. Now there may well be a skull somewhere that this matches up with very nicely, but personally I'd just like something a bit more stereotypical, if that makes sense. Now that's out of the way, let's look at the detail. Now first look at the detail built up on the beak. I love the craggy texture here. That detail is carried through up into the maxillary area. And that detail is nothing short of exquisite, which is a word that's in danger of being overused on this channel. The mandible, the eyelids, and around the orbit. Unlike the PNSO, which went with a cheekless look, there's a suggestion of it in the closed mouth. And from the top, I love these subtle pattern infusions, looking wonderfully and realistically like subcutaneous pigment. The flashy orange makes for a very nice accent. You also see the beginning of those midline scutes, starting at the tiniest of sizes. Now maybe it's my imagination, but in the neck, the tininess of scale seems to be on a new level. A little help from the almond here. The scale detail is as always complemented by the fine skin creases. Now just a look at the front of the neck here helps you appreciate this. It has that mesh armor look, which is pleasing both to the sight and touch. As for the body, the bioplan is very well known, and I think it's captured quite nicely, with a couple caveats I'll mention later. And I love the very warm colours as a base, with different shades of orange and a kind of bisque in the posterior limbs and the nether regions. The whole animal looks very vibrant. There are also infusions of purple in the sides of the body, as well as the neck. The paint application is a showpiece of what Haolonggood can do. The mottling is done so naturally, with varying degrees of starkness, but it all looks like subcutaneous pigmentation to me, nothing slapped on. Now here you can see the very pleasing crenulated appearance created by the midline scutes in different forms, so having an irregular organic look that Haolonggood does so well. Some even look broken. I'm really liking the very dark, almost black appearance of these running down the back. The detail down the shoulders, once again, is representative of the overall quality detail. And as we head down, you can see the richness of colour. Really love how these spots just almost seep into or from the skin. And I love the infuscation that Haolonggood often gives its dinosaurs in the distalmost parts like the hands and feet. And actually here in the hands is a bit of a puzzle. You of course have that spiked thumb, but you also see what appears to be a spiked fifth digit. This double spike configuration, while cool, takes away from the special prehensile nature of digit 5. That aside, the texture is really very pleasing. There's a kind of a gnarly appearance in the hands that speak of lived-in rough use. In the flank, we see the same kind of scale detail, with colours that are really complex, and look really amazing in person. Objectively, this patterning is indeed a very welcome change. Subjectively, however, because I do have trypophobia, this took a few days to get used to, especially these more starkly painted spots here. I do like the inclusion of purple undertones here. Then moving down the hind limbs, we get the same kind of detail, and here again the pattern is already really good, but infused into the skin as it is extra nice indeed. Then in the tail, where the stripes take on different levels of saturation, which is a nice variation you might find in a real animal. And so much for the brown. Now here's the blue, or I should say grey. Now up close, you can see that while this color palette seems really overused, and you consider it on its own merits, you may feel differently. There are subtleties that make it different. For example, and I hope my camera can pick it up, but there are subtle undertones of green to the grey. Also, you'll see at the boundary between grey and yellow, inclusions of darker pigmentation, making for a very under-the-skin feel. And I think just a once-over will suffice to give you a taste of this variant. Now just look at the beak with that texture, and then going up the head, including the eyelids, I think you can see how good the detail is. I like how the texture looks with this darker colouring. Now just look at the exquisite scale detail down the forelimb. The hind limbs now. I like the accenting of the posterior aspect, with this pale yellow. And from the top, you can see how a different feel is created just from different viewing angles. I really like how these stripes sit in a sea of grey. The tail, so that's our once over. Now just a couple points of interest. When PNSO came out with their Iguanodon, there was some question as to whether the head followed more Mantellisaurus or Iguanodon itself. At the very least, there was a general agreement that it was certainly atypical. I believe that Paleonerd wrote a blog article describing just such a specimen, but I can no longer find it, or maybe I just dreamt it. Now, speaking very primitively for myself, while it would be a treat if I knew a lot about Iguanodon to have a specific specimen manifested, I really would like a model that follows common depictions rather than have one I can only enjoy if I had very exacting knowledge. The PNSO Parasaurolophus recreates a specific specimen, ROM 768, with a defect probably caused by injury. And while some people didn't like that, and for someone new to the interest, might even link this to the trope of a crest that fits nicely into a notch during cervical extension, at least in general, I'd say this is unequivocally Parasaurolophus. Now, some features as described by Paul I referenced in the PNSO Iguanodon review were a dentary that's relatively short and deep, nasals with a slight Roman nose, and very obvious posterior vertical expansion. Now, when it comes to the Haolonggood, I think that these points are met. You can see a very deep boxy head with a robust mandible. However, while lacking the slenderness in the PNSO Iguanodon head, Haolonggood seems to have gone in the opposite direction, which is the inclusion of this bump here. Now, a slight Roman nose is present in Iguanodon, but this seems to be exaggerated, reminding me of Critosaurus. Now, one could argue for inflatable soft tissue, a popular idea in recent years for various hadrosaurs, but a few points argue against this. Now, first, the attachment points of the soft tissue. Hadrosaurs typically have large external nares, as illustrated by Jaime A. Headden, and I imagine that the soft tissue sac will attach lower. Second, even if the sac does attach higher, which is a possible idea, it seems to me that if this were an inflated sac, I'd expect some lateral expansion here as well, instead of which we have a relatively narrow form here. So it looks more like hard tissue to me. I thought it might be Alturinus, but I think the shape of the bulge doesn't fit, and the underlying structure of the nares is just in the wrong size, shape and location. Accounting for overlying keratin, this would be even bigger. I'll link to Jaime's blog article below, so you can read more about hadrosaur narial soft tissue. It does remind me of some critosaurids, and perhaps quite close to the iguanodontid Coirodon. Of course, there's such a thing as morphological diversity. Spend some time in an anatomy lab, and you'll quickly appreciate this. Now, given the other plus points, you may like to call this keratin and just enjoy the model. Now, I'm sure many of you know more about iguanodontian anatomy than I do, so I look forward to your comments. Secondly, the hands. Now, you guys know I have almost a fetish for unusual hands, such as in Carnotaurus, T-Rex, not to mention, of course, the sauropods. Now, one thing I've been in love with since 1985 was the Swiss Army hand, explained in David Norman's Encyclopedia of Dinosaurs. and in more detail in his 1980 description. The prehensile digit 5, spiked digit 1, and the weight-bearing ability of the other 3 are just fascinating. So it's a bit disappointing and puzzling that they've added a spike to digit 5. You can certainly paint it over, but it won't have a consistent texture with the other fingers. Of course, at this size, it will be quite easy to overlook. Now, a third point we can talk about is the tail. Now, many hadrosauriforms had stiff tails, also reinforced by a trellis of what are commonly called ossified tendons, though many believe that these are more homologous to epaxial muscle. Later hadrosaurids took this to an extreme. Iguanodon does possess these in the dorsal and in the anterior caudals. Now, these chevrons would also limit movement, particularly in the sagittal plane. But the number of these ossified tendons decrease as we progress down the tail. Norman notes that they're usually absent beyond the 20th vertebra. You can also see how the chevrons essentially disappear, potentially granting more movement. So some degree of sinuosity is possible in the latter half of the tail. Personally, I'm going to try to straighten this a little. Now, I want to end by saying that ultimately you choose according to your tastes. If you're happy that your model represents a specific specimen, you'll be okay with this. If you're looking for a model that represents your image of a typical iguanodon, you may not. If you like anatomy, you may be more exacting, but really the understanding of anatomy changes over time. And some of my observations may very well be wrong. So don't let anyone tell you what to like. I think there's too much negativity these days to add some from a hobby that should make us happy. Let's get to the comparisons. First, let's compare them to each other. I'm going to compare them regionally, so you have a rough idea what each looks like, but I'll say that much depends on your lighting and your personal mood as well. For example, in some lighting, I think detail shows up better on the grey, while at other times they're clearer on the brown. This also varies by region, of course. Now, my personal favorite would still be the brown. Next, we obviously have to look at the PNSO Iguanodon. Now, you can see in terms of size, there isn't that much difference. There's an overall somberness to the color, which I didn't like at first, but I've started to really appreciate. We have to look at the heads in comparison, of course. And then in terms of detail, you can see why PNSO was in a class of its own even 3 or 4 years ago. It's just incredibly real. Pose-wise, while the Haolonggood appears to be having a very lively jaunt, the PNSO is more of a stately, dignified walk. Then we have the Era Terror Iguanodon, also 1 to 35. Now once again, size-wise, there's not much difference. Addendum is currently revising the sculpt, making changes to some areas, such as the musculature. But I use it as an example of something that's a bit more representative. There will be some differences in opinion, but when I look at the skull in the Era Terror, this is the kind of look that's less likely to generate much debate. Now, skin detail, you can see a different aesthetic in Addendum's work. And the final Iguanodon I have today is the Carnegie collection. and I think you can see why I still love it. It's not exactly retro, and at the time, this represented the state of the art. Times change, ideas change, and this freezes an era in time. Now let's look at some other hadrosaurs. Here's the Haolonggood Saurolophus. Unfortunately, I actually don't have many Iguanodon models for comparison. I have the wild safari somewhere, I swear, but where I know not. The Haolonggood Teratolophus. And what a way we've travelled. Here's their early Uranosaurus. Now strictly speaking, it's a hadrosauriform, and yes, it's the version with inaccurate hands, since I didn't like the paint application in the corrected version. Of course, the mother of them all. This is the Haolonggood Shandongsaurus. For PNSO, I'll just show you a couple hadrosaurids. We have the PNSO Parasaurolophus. And the splendid PNSO Edmontosaurus. And finally, the PNSO Wilson and Cameron. So that's it for the Haolonggood Iguanodon. Now between the Haolonggood and the PNSO, I'm really torn, because while Haolonggood certainly has that robust feel I associate with the Iguanodon head, it's got that bump. And the PNSO is so dignified and refined, with a soft fineness of texture, subtlety in paint application, a quiet dignity, a grace to the movement, and a stateliness of pose, not to mention the more correct hands and a stiffer tail that still makes it hard for me to throw it over. So I'm going to chicken out for now and call this undecided. Now you can't get things perfect unless you're an independent artist who can sculpt a model based on the skeletal you choose with proportions you match. Ultimately, these are beautiful models in their own right. Again, I urge you to speculate for fun, but focus on what's right rather than what's wrong. If anything, let morphological diversity come to the rescue. Let me know what you think, and I'll see you in the next video.